Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Housing has probably become the #1 issue to protect the social fabric of our community. And as a result, it's one of the top priorities for the Alliance. Recently, the Alliance applied for and received a READY grant. That's a Rural Economic Development Initiative grant from the state and in partnership with the city of Durango. And the objective of the grant is to create a deliverable that's a workforce housing investment strategy or investment plan. And we have hired Project Moxie and team to create such a deliverable for us in an expeditious way. That deliverable will be for the benefit of the community, the broader community, and be directly given to our public partners in La Plata County. So with that being said, the objective of today is to create a foundation or a baseline of the subject of housing. With us, we have Capelli Consulting, Project Moxie, and Homes Fund. So I'd like to thank all three of those organizations for collaborating, coming together to create this quick program. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jonathan Capelli.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Hi, everyone. Jonathan Capelli with Capelli Consulting. We're just going to jump into some introductions of the team and then move on to the agenda and roll from there. So thanks, Matt, for that. So yeah, we're a firm that's been around for about 7 years, working in Denver and Craig, Leadville, a little bit in Pueblo, San Luis Valley, a variety of different places with both municipalities and foundations and nonprofits, all working, to try and further their affordable housing goals in all those different contexts. That team is comprised of myself and also Mary and Augustina. Mary, if you want to quick introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Mary Coddington, and yeah, on the Capelli Consulting team. I'll keep it brief because we've got a lot of good content to get to. Thanks. And I think Augustina is on as well.
Hello there, I'm Augustina Remedios, and I am also in Capelli Consulting.
Thanks a lot. And we'll pass it on to Project Moxie.
Hi, everyone. Jen Lopez here from Hermosa. I've been in Durango since 1991. Moved away for a little bit and came back. Love this community so much. Been doing affordable housing work for 21 years in several states, and I'm happy to be working here with Mike and team. And I have some incredible people on my team as well. So I think I'll have Cynthia just say hello. Cynthia's got over 25 years in land use entitlement work, and she takes the first look at sites for us on our team. Cynthia, you want to say hi? All right. You can say hi later. And then we have Matt Lynn. Matt, would you say hello and give a little introduction?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I work as the Director of Community Engagement at Project Moxie. I have a background in marketing and communications. I'm based out of Denver with frequent travel to the Durango area, and happy to be part of this call today. And we appreciate your time and interest in this really important subject.
We're gonna get Lisa here in a second. I think Matt's trying to forward the slide. There we go. Lisa, this is you. Would you like to say hello, Lisa? Give a little introduction.
You bet. Happy New Year, everyone. My name is Lisa Blomquist. I'm the Executive Director for Homes Fund. Homes Fund is a Durango-based nonprofit organization that serves the 5 counties of Region 9. So Montezuma, Dolores, La Plata, San Juan, and Archuleta counties. And I'll be going over a bit more about who we are and what we do later in the presentation. And thank you all for joining us.
All right, so to hit some of the points that that Mike mentioned, we're going to try to cover affordable housing in the following ways. I'm going to start off with the housing market and just kind of give a context of what's going on and how that's affecting La Plata, and then get into some housing terms and definitions. This is well, each space is wonky to itself, right? In terms of its jargon. I do feel like housing is particularly jargony and wonky. So we're going to try and smooth that over, make sure we're all talking the same language. And then get into sort of a housing toolbox, some sort of a high-level overview of some of the ways that we can address some of the affordable housing issues we're looking at here, and some strategies. Then talk through our scope of work, how we're planning on addressing those issues, and then get into a Q&A and discussion with you all. So that is essentially how we're going to try to cover this. I think next slide. So overall outlook, we're expecting incomes to increase at the national level by about 3.3%. Basically, employers trying to figure out how to retain their workforce in the sort of uncertain climate with folks moving around a lot of workplace flexibility will continue to be a thing. So the Zoom cities and Zoom towns probably is not going away. Maybe never. We'll see. This might just be the new reality.
Hi, Greg.
Oh. Hey, Jack. As far as how the financial sector is sort of adjusting, we're expecting interest rates to rise a couple times in 2022. This will affect how investors are incentivized to actually invest in housing. But then simultaneously, there's this, the housing market, which is continuing to skyrocket, not as much as it did last year, but they're predicting about 11%. So the main takeaway is that housing affordability is going to continue to be a big issue. There's also issues with supply chain delays and inflation. There's a ton of issues at the national level that are affecting housing everywhere, and we're definitely going to be feeling in La Plata County as well. So it's good timing to come up with a strategy for how to address these issues. I'll turn it over to Jen for the local housing market.
Actually, Lisa, I think we're going to have you do this one. You want to do this slide?
I'm happy to, and please chime in if you have any input, Jen. So the local housing market, we have all of the same problems that the national housing market does, but kind of more so in a lot of ways, because we are a small rural area. We don't have a major interstate passing through, so things like supply chain issues are an even bigger problem here. Our just lack of critical mass also adds to the diminishing supply. The Zoom boom was a huge phenomenon and will probably continue to be a big. This is a good place to be. It's a good place to retire to. It's a good place to work remotely from. All of these factors are affecting us locally, really even more so than a lot of other places. There are kind of mitigating factors in larger metropolitan areas that we don't necessarily have here. We're dealing with our diminishing supply, our lightning absorption. As soon as a home is built, it's sold. We're kind of in this quasi resort community where we have a lot of the problems of resort communities, but we don't have well, Herg is up the road, but it is up the road, and we're kind of this quasi resort community here. We're really facing a very challenging affordable homeownership market right now for a lot of the reasons that Jonathan just said, and with the Fed making good on their promise to increase interest rates, that's going to make it even harder for low and moderate income people, even moderate and higher income people, to find a house that they can afford in this community. There are things being done about it, and we're going to be going over some options for other things that we can do to help alleviate the pressure on our housing market. And thank you very much for being here to listen. Jen, do you have anything you'd like to add about our local market?
No, just it's the worst it's ever been, right? That's why we have 60 people on the call. So
right, and
working together.
I'll point out this little box here that that the average sale price in November in both the city of Durango and in La Plata County exceeded $1 million. And of course, when we think of averages, the tails really skew the average. That's why we use the median typically. But still, seeing an average home price of over $1 million for the month of November in both the city and the county is really shocking, and really displays our urgency for doing something about this.
Matt, are you able to forward the slide? Oh, one too far? No, is this it?
Yep, that's right. Either Mary or Matt want to jump in here.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and jump in. We're actually going to jump into some breakout rooms to talk through these 3 questions. What does housing affordability mean to you? Affordable to whom? That's always a big part of the question. What would an equitable housing market in La Plata County look like? And what are the negative consequences of not having housing options? And because I think the share automatically stops when we go into the breakout rooms, I'll just go ahead and put those into the chat so everybody has them. And we'll spend about 15 minutes just chatting about these in smaller groups.
Come on. Come on. That's cool.
waiting and watching the participant numbers, trying to see how many of these groups are being pulled back in. Should just be, oh, here we go.
Recorded.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Hopefully, everyone got a chance to participate in some interesting discussions and perhaps meet some people in the group that they weren't acquainted with beforehand. With that, we will, I know in the group I was in, a lot of the topics that are in the rest of the discussion were kind of previewed in the conversation. So we can go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about what's causing some of the demand issues that we're seeing. Make sure Jen's back.
Thank
in the room.
you. I am back. Thank you
Great.
so much. So, many of you could probably do this slide for me, right? But just to recap, to make sure we're on the same page, whenever we start to think about designing solutions, we want to be consistent on how we define the problem. So, right, COVID impacts, right? We were one of those communities hit really hard. Lots of resort, Western, beautiful, awesome places are being hit really hard. But I don't know that any of us would have imagined less than 2 weeks of inventory. And I know Bob Allen's on with us. Bob, I'd love to catch up with you sometime. I know your data is amazing, but so these are little snapshots from Herald articles and whatnot. Supply chain, I was just in in our breakout session talking to Elizabeth from Housing Solutions, and when she was sharing a personal story about not getting washers and dryers in a project. I mean, it is really intense right now, right? And I know we've got some other builders on and could speak to this much better than I. Land inventory, this area has always had issues with land, and it's because it's a beautiful place. Land is expensive. Sometimes there's zoning issues, sometimes it's an infrastructure challenge, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm excited to say that this community is working on some solutions around that. We've also had labor shortages for a long time. So I think we're hearing more across the state and locally about some innovations to address that, and excited about those. We've also been a community that's always had a market mismatch, right? We've always, let me back up. That's the wages, sorry. Market mismatch is the idea that, if you're a builder in a community, you're going to build where you can make money and where there's demand. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what we'd expect you to do. But because we haven't been able to bring in product below $500,000 in a long time consistently, right? It's just been edging up that market when we've been able to build. And then the wages mismatch we've had for many, many decades, right? And so we know this is an incredible community to work, and that the wages have historically been a little bit on the low side. I know that's changing, my French. We talk a lot about some really high paying jobs that are coming into the region, but we had a 20% jump in prices nationally, right? And that's the highest jump in prices we've seen since they've been reporting them at the federal government level. So this is just unprecedented. Next. And then Housing Solutions and Southwest COG got Root Policy, which is a very well-known consulting firm out of Denver, to do a needs assessment for the 5-county region. And this is a nice snapshot of what should we be focusing on in La Plata County over the next 3 years. I mean, if we can do this, this is going to be amazing. This is a very aggressive scorecard, but I think it's really good. So seasonal beds, the idea, right, that we have certain needs that track along seasonal employment. We've really not tracked that before. So the study does a good job of saying we need about 45 seasonal beds. Low-income rentals, we've actually been really good as a community in doing the low-income housing tax credit program. Aspero, VOA has properties, Mercy has properties, Lumion. So we've done a good job, but we still have a need there, just because there are a lot of folks who can't afford, rents above $625. We also solve this part of the population need with project-based vouchers, and we're hoping that we'll be seeing more of those in the near future. These are, hi, Tim Wheeler, this is a 3-year snapshot, not annual. Thank you. Workforce rentals are that spot that's, we really haven't done a ton with outside of the market. And I think of Jerry Pope and Emil Wanaka's product in Three Springs as being sort of this attainable product back in the day, but it's that workforce rental that rents between $625 and $1,750. And then ownership units, all day long, right? We could be building, and that's where we have the biggest gap and the biggest need, and that's between 380 and 525. And again, most people on this webinar I see are probably familiar with some of these numbers. Next, Matt. Mary, is this you or me?
This one was originally you. Happy to talk about it if you'd like.
Oh, okay. I think I will go ahead and do this one. We're going to start getting into definitions because we get this a lot when we kick off projects like this. And if we're not in some kind of agreement about definitions, it becomes very challenging to come together on vision. All we're saying here is we're at a moment in time where we're talking less about affordable housing and more about housing affordability. And what that means is there's a lot of people who cannot afford to be here, right? So it's just an unprecedented problem. We got to talk about it differently. General housing affordability across the community, right? There are so few housing units available that it's impacting households earning over 130,000 a year. We know that. And then traditional affordable housing, or we'll call subsidized or regulated affordable housing, the lowest income households are quickly running out of options and many are facing homelessness, right? So we know homelessness has been a huge issue in this community for the last several years as well. We got to be watching across that continuum. It's impacting across the continuum. So the takeaway is we need to increase inventory across the continuum as quickly as we can. And I know, again, we've got a lot of our leadership here locally saying the same thing. So I think there's a lot of alignment and opportunity. Next, Matt.
All right, so this one pivots over to me. So there's a distinction that Jen drew between housing affordability and what's considered traditional affordable housing. But just to really get clear and get consensus on a definition for affordable housing, all affordable housing means is that you're paying no more than 30% of your gross income for your housing costs. So either your rent or your mortgage plus utilities. And that sort of comes in two stripes. It's regulated affordable housing. So that's where there has been some subsidy usually in the project. And those homes now have income restrictions. And a lot of times if there is public money going into those projects, they're going to have something to preserve that affordability for the long term so that it's not just lost when the next owner or tenant comes in. So there'll be a restricted covenant or land use restriction recorded on the property. The other stripe is naturally occurring affordable housing, which is market rate housing that just happens to be leased or sold affordably. And this is what I think in communities across Colorado, we've seen almost disappear entirely from the market. Where they do show up tends to be in older housing stock, but at this point, even that is nearly impossible to find. On the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about area median income, which I know is a term there's probably varied amounts of familiarity with in the Zoom room here. But it's one of the metrics that we use to calculate affordability, regardless of if we're talking about very low income or higher up through the spectrum. And this is just looking at a particular community, what is the middle number that most people in that community are earning in their income. And it's considered in the basis of household size. So if you look at the bottom row, that 100%, that's the middle number in the community, the median number. So for a single person household, in La Plata County in 2021, that was identified as about $61,000 a year. The thing that this chart struggles with is if you look at the 2% household, there's no distinction on whether that's a two-earner income household or a single parent with a kid. And so obviously that makes a difference on the household and where you fall at that percentage of area median income. So if it's a two-income earner household, you might be closer to this 100% $70,000 a year. But if it's a parent with a child, you're looking at the $35,000 a year. And that's how we talk about and measure affordability. And you can see these call out boxes here with the state minimum wage increase that just was enacted at the beginning of the year. A single parent working 40 hours a week at minimum wage would, if they had 3 children at home, would be in this 30% area median income. 2 parents working full-time at minimum wage would be at this $52,000 income. So, we have the AMI piece of the puzzle, the area median income piece of the puzzle, and then the other piece of the puzzle that everyone talks about is spending 30% of your household income on housing. That's the number that we sort of use to define, is your housing affordable? And it seems like, where does that come from? Yeah, there are HUD guidelines and different things, but it isn't actually that arbitrary. So this graphic on the left here shows sort of, okay, there's that 30% of the total income available for housing. But then when you think of all of the other expenses that we have at home, when you calculate income tax and transportation and groceries and childcare, being 9 or 10% of your household income, what's left over, that's everything that you have for clothing and toiletries, spending money, health insurance, phone, internet, all of these things that are still essentials, but aren't counted sort of in this calculation. And very quickly, you're running out of that surplus money while you still have these needs. And, savings sort of becomes a pipe dream. And, building your wealth becomes a pipe dream. And so 30% is really, really the maximum. But then when you consider so many Coloradans and so many people in La Plata County are spending 45, 50% of their income on housing, you can kind of extrapolate what's left for these other buckets going forward. And in a Shift Research Lab study, these numbers are a little bit out of date. It's probably worse now. It's estimated that there's $2 billion of revenue not circulating in our economy because people don't have enough money to spend in these other areas that are really essential because the cost of housing is so high. So kind of going back to this talking about the different price points along what we often call the housing continuum, where we're talking about affordability at different income levels. There are lots of terms and definitions. I know a few we've already used in this call. So we've got workforce housing, we have middle income housing, community housing, attainable housing. Feel free to jump in on the chat. I know there are a lot of people on the call, but with your thoughts about what those mean. And I'll just give 30 seconds to see if any pop in or so. And the interesting thing about this is both within and across communities, each of these terms can be defined a little bit differently. And I think in the breakout room that I was in, we touched on this a little bit. I think it came up also in the broader call that, it creates ambiguity and it makes it hard to work towards the same goals if we're not using the same definitions on these. So Matt, if you can just go ahead and start forwarding the animations on this. Nice, thanks, Jen. Community housing, housing for the locals. So with workforce housing, it's often used to talk about, I've heard it is low to moderate income workforce. So those in service industry and recreation industry and civil service sectors, a lot of times it's defined as an AMI range. I've heard it defined as 80 to 120% of the area median income. Middle income housing can be used to indicate affordability for white collar households. Community housing can be used to indicate a lot of times affordability for the people who are essential to the community, for people who are staffing the coffee shop or providing childcare and things like that, but definitely aren't able to reach prices as they're going up. And then attainable housing, that's one that I've heard a lot used interchangeably with the other categories or with affordable housing in order to make it more politically palatable. And so I think a lot of times in trying to get overly specific or in trying to make things politically palatable, we've kind of entered into a word soup that creates more confusion. So to the right there, you see below market housing. Basically, what we're talking about when we're talking about all of these is housing for people who live here that the market is not providing for. And it's a great catch-all term to kind of put those things in. And that's what we want to focus on more throughout the rest of this conversation. The other important thing to note here is that while communities to various levels of effectiveness define these things in different ways, it's really important to note that funders aren't necessarily talking about them in the ways that communities decide and agree on that they want to use. And so it's important to be cognizant of the funder language, even if you choose to use something else in your community. And then just checking the chat. On the next slide, you can see this is called the housing bridge, and feel free to disregard the actual dollar amount income levels that are there. They're more generic for the purposes of the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority. But the important takeaways here to look at is in the lowest leftmost section, you have the folks that are eligible for federal subsidies. So this is looking at emergency shelter, affordable subsidized rentals, in some cases market rate rentals if people are using vouchers. The missing middle, which a lot of times it refers to first-time home buyers, potentially seniors who are downsizing, and then market rate housing, which is serving a lot of, traditionally it's been for a long time, 120% of the area median income and above. That percentage is shrinking, and it's now seeming even more like 140% of the area median income and above, even higher with the number that Lisa cited earlier of the $1 million average price point in November. And then on the following slide, it's sort of another way at getting at the same thing. And you can see here, you know, the housing continuum goes from homeless shelters to transitional housing all the way up to long-term home ownership. And one of the reasons that I really like this slide, you can see on here, you know, when we talk about workforce housing, you can see different areas of the workforce sort of at almost each of these levels. Food service workers, administrative assistants, different people that are needed in our community. But understanding the housing continuum and being really specific about where we're dialing in on it is important. And it's a lot to take on to try to address all of it. So it's important to have a lot of different groups and strategies working to meet the different levels of need. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa to start talking about some of the strategies and tools.
So when we're talking about building housing, and we covered earlier some of the barriers to us having the supply that we need, you know, supply chain issues that are national. We've got commodity prices that are skyrocketing, particularly lumber. When you have all of these factors put together that make it so that a unit of housing costs $550,000 to build, how do you get someone into that home that where 30% of their income is $1,200 a month? The math just doesn't really work, right? And so in order to overcome that gap and make the math work, there are basically two ways you can approach this. You can either subsidize the developer in the development, or you could subsidize the household. So there are several programs, there are many programs that do both of these things. When we're talking about low-income housing tax credits, it's often abbreviated as LIHTC. That is a development subsidy. So basically it's taking federal tax credits, putting them through a massive system and spitting them out as equity for an affordable housing project. And that makes it so that the developer can build these units in a way that he or she can rent them out at a level that is permanently affordable. On the household end, and this is the end that Homes Fund really works in. You can increase the capacity of the household to purchase the home. So, in essence, either raising their income or raising their purchasing power through financing means. So on the rental end, Section 8 vouchers are an example of increasing the household capacity for getting rental housing. On the homeownership end, we've got down payment assistance. It's also known as mortgage assistance, and Homes Fund has that for our region. So basically, let's say a household can afford a $300,000 first mortgage, and the home that they find is $75,000. Homes Fund comes in with a $75,000 second mortgage that has no payments on it, 0% interest, and we have a shared appreciation model where they pay us back from a share of the appreciation. I'm going to go over that later, but basically what we're doing is we're boosting the amount of buying power that a household has without burdening them, without making them more housing burdened and payment burdened than they would have been. So basically, these are the two approaches. There's the subsidize the developer approach, and then there's the subsidize the household approach. There are some organizations that combine these. Habitat for Humanity tends to combine these and put in both a development subsidy and a household subsidy. And really we need to be creative as a community in how we look at development subsidies. Where are those coming from? Are those coming from unusual sources that didn't used to need to incentivize developers? And same for the household. For the household subsidy, we need to be creative about this and really do everything that we can to create the affordable housing and help people to overcome the barriers either to development or toward rental or purchase. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Lisa. This is so where does that get us? We just spoke through how AMI is calculated and what the needs are. So why isn't this being built, and why is it not already being served by the market? If there's a demand, presumably there'd be a supply that rose to meet that, right? That's not really the case, of course, which is why we're all on this call. So we're going to kind of talk through some of the numbers for why that is. So this is an example of funding gaps implicit in below market housing construction. So what it costs to build. Building housing, below market housing, often costs as much as building a market rate a market rate home, but you're going to have less income coming from that property to cover some of the debt. So you have, in this sample project here, $8 million in construction costs, $300,000 for the land alone, infrastructure, soft costs, so things like design and permitting and fees and legal fees, all those things that aren't actually going into the building. But you need all of that to get to the top of $8.8 million in this example. This is a multifamily unit, 2 bedrooms, and is actually based on a real project that we were looking at. So not in the area, it's just from our backgrounds. And so when you add up all of the, so then you kind of roll over a little bit to halfway through the screen on the top. So who are we trying to serve? And it's people at 30% and 60% AMI. Just a quick nod to the earlier question in the chat. We were talking about the incomes being skewed up because of the number of people that are making their money elsewhere. Fortunately, the AMI is really supposed to look at the whole community and then say, okay, what is the median income of person to person in that community? Now, it is increased by having more folks who move in who are richer. It's not increased as much as you might think, because it's the median, not the average, so it's not being pulled around as much, but it still is definitely affecting that. However, most housing, affordable housing programs focus on the 30% to 60%, so they're pretty far down anyway. Which, as Mary's chart showed, 30% AMI is $18,000 a year, and then 50 is $30,000 a year. So you're still, even with the slightly inflated median income, you're still reaching lower incomes, just as a note. So at any rate, this project looked at how to house people at 30% and 60%, gives you an idea of what the total rent is and the operating costs, and you're left with this gap at the bottom between the 8.8 million over here and the for the total development costs, and then the capital gap. So you still have a $7.6 to $8.5 capital gap, which is pretty huge to develop the site. So that's why it's not being built. The rents alone for a project that costs the same as a market rate project to build are not going to be enough to pay off the cost. So next slide, please. So by comparison, looking at a market rate development, you get up to this $457,000. This is another real world example, but it's just a single family home. The purchase price is $482,000. The developer makes $25K in profit, and that's the end of that story. They're good. That's why this is getting built, and often with an incentive to go even higher, right, in cost, because there's someone who will be able to buy it at profit. Next slide. So this is a comparison of looking just at market rate, just at multifamily properties, comparing how they are financed compared to affordable housing at different affordability levels. And so the blue is debt. That is what a bank is willing to lend to develop the project. And they'll lend this much expecting to get, a bunch back, right? So if you're doing a conventional project, they'll be able to give you 70%, and then the rest you'll have to come up with your own on your own. If you're a market rate developer that's pretty big, you probably just have that cash so you can cover that, and then you'll produce the project, and the bank is guaranteed to get all that money back plus interest, right? When you get down to a low income, there's less ability to pay off a huge amount of debt in the amount of time that the bank needs, or wants rather, to get that profit. So they're only going to be able to lend a much smaller amount. To make up that difference, you're going to need a whole suite of other subsidies. One of the main ways to do that is something called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC. There's two main LIHTC programs in the country. It's the 4%, which is this one, and then the 9%, which you'll see a little bit later. You'll hear these terms thrown around. Just ignore 4%. It doesn't really mean anything relevant to this conversation, and 9% doesn't really either. But know that if you're talking about 4% LIHTC, you're talking about something that's not competitive. It's easier to get these, but it gives you only about 30% of the equity that you need to cover this gap. So depending on how low you're going in income, you might need more than that. So LIHTC, the 4% LIHTC might not be enough. Okay, so moving over, you get to low income housing. So this is even lower rents are what's being charged, right? So now banks are saying, I'm only going to be 45% because I'm not ready to wait 60 years to get my money back plus the interest that I'm charging you. So you have even more subsidy that's needed. So this project has both this 4% LIHTC, that 30% in green, plus our state housing tax credit program, giving another 20%. Finally, you get over to the very low income housing, and banks are, they went from 70% to 30%, right? And now you're having to rely on this competitive tax credit called the 9% tax credit, of which lots of developers who are developing affordable housing apply for every year, and only a small percentage actually get that because it's in such high demand. And that's how you pull off the project. This is a little simplified, however, because the total, there's usually still a little bit of a gap that's going to come from local grants, state grants, cities, paying into it. It's kind of like if you're just like a couple inches short of the rim when you're trying to dunk, it doesn't really matter, right? No one cares if you can almost dunk. You have to be able to get all the way there. So what's really important to know is that even if you get 90%, 95% of this funding through all these sources, if you can't get all the way to 100% of the cost, you're not going to make it, which is why in reality, this chart would have, maybe 5 more lines of different funding sources that were needed in order to cover the last small gap to get up to the full cost. I'm realizing now, Matt, that I think there's some animations on this slide because there's some text in it. There we go. Would you mind just populating through that really quick? So I could have said less and just let you guys read that in retrospect. Let's see. Yep, that answers everything. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, actually, yeah, go back one more.
You know what, Jonathan? There was a couple questions related to the
Oh,
slide, and I was
okay.
gonna take a stab at the answers, but would love you to jump in as well. Scott Shine, you're asking about what's the expected rate of return for developers who get subsidies, public subsidies. I would like to come back on a general answer, but I will talk about tax credit returns because I know those really well. And just quickly, when a private or nonprofit developer looks at doing a tax credit project, their return on investment and time is the opposite of what you would expect when you do market rate rental development. When you do market rate rental development, you are getting your return on the rents, right? The rent rolls, the rent coming in, and then your property, values going up over time. With tax credit development, it's the opposite. The developer is getting paid out within the first couple of years of doing the project, because the program is set up and recognizes that in order for rents to be low, you can't have a lot of cash flow, right? So you're not going to incentivize developers by having a robust cash flow. So they get a developer fee, they get some of them have an integrated company, so they also make funds because they're property managing that property. They might have a construction company as well. So it's a little bit complicated, but Scott, it's a great question, and I promise I'll circle back with a little bit better and not in this session, but a future session or an email about sort of how to think about.
Jen,
yeah.
if that's helpful, and if I could just maybe drill it down a little bit.
Yep.
To like the local level for, a local elected official who's, like Jonathan was saying, getting the project over the goal line or over the rim and contributing a little bit of money. What do they need to be ready to accept as far as a profit for a private partner? And I know that's going to vary by project and everything, but the question was more about at the local level, how do you get comfortable contributing public funds to a private entity, making money and realizing that that's part of the equation? So it was more just to get in our mind that's what these partnerships entail. So
yep.
just for future reference.
You bet. Thank you, Scott. Good to see you. That could be a whole session. Maybe we do it right in a future, because we get this question a lot, and you're going to see this in some of the strategy slides. But the punchline there is oftentimes when I'm working with the local government and I'm trying to negotiate some public subsidies for a development project, we have standard underwriting around a project. So we want to see it be sustainable, right? That it works. And so there's just, reasonable return on investment in those underwriting documents we can share with you all. But what we typically find, I'm going to kind of take the other stance, is that local governments will provide subsidies, and it's not enough to subsidize something long-term. So there's a sweet spot. And again, there's lots of best practices that Division of Housing and CHAFA use already that we can pull out for local government. And I'm sure Lisa could help with some of this as well. The sweet spot where you are able to partner with a private developer, have something provided that's a public benefit that can be recycled or stay in place for a certain amount of time, that makes economic sense to that developer. So longer conversation, different session, great question. The other question we had, though, that's easier to answer, and I'm going to go ahead and go there, Ava, is that the tax credit program is very competitive. CHAFA runs that program, and they do change their priorities every year. And they do that through this process called the Qualified Allocation Plan. It is a public process. Later this year, there'll be public hearings, and we can, make sure that our local leaders have access to those hearings. We haven't typically had a lot of involvement in those hearings per se, but we should probably start thinking about that, because that is a critical resource for the community moving forward. I will tell you, I just rolled off the CHAFA board that where they're going is energy efficiency is going to be the next really big thing. So I think it's going to be less about, they always want to know that, Bob Allen, that the market can absorb the units you're building. Even if they're below market, they want to see that market study. But in terms of priorities, for years it was people experiencing homelessness. I think it's going to move very fast to energy efficiency, a little bit more diversity. I think you're also going to see more in the seniors. I think you're going to see more trying to address our aging population, things like that. So great questions.
That was great. Thanks.
Yeah. Jonathan, do you want to add anything to those questions?
Sure. Just yeah, the qualified allocation plan. So what Jen was talking about, Mary just pasted a link in there so you can kind of see what their priorities are, from energy efficiency to everything else. Although I guess you're not saying the energy efficiency is in that yet, but will be soon. Well, one last note on this is just the lower the rent, and so in other words, the more affordable the unit, the less money a lender is willing to give. The flip side is that the lower the rent, the more money a public or philanthropic entity is willing to give to subsidize it. So the higher the rent goes, the more difficult it can be to actually find the subsidy to cover that gap. And in one of our breakout groups, we were talking a little about everyone is talking about the missing middle. That's kind of what that comes from, where it's not quite enough for the market to think it's a good idea or a good deal, or but not low enough in income for philanthropic groups to oh.
Can we have whoever mute,
yeah.
whoever, don't know who's not muted, but if everybody could mute, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's basically the overview. The next section we're going to jump into now is going to be strategy. And so, okay, so here's the problem. We defined the terms. What are some sample ways at getting at this? But we want to pause this really quick and see if that makes sense. So we're all on the same page. Does everyone get affordable housing now? But like
Housing, not just affordable,
sorry,
right?
housing,
We're moving away
housing.
from that housing markets.
Thanks,
That's why
Jen.
we're in a crisis. Yeah. I'm sure you don't, but I hope we've started getting the juices going in different directions. I think the biggest punchline, Jonathan, that your team has done is that we need a lot more players at the table. We need a lot more innovation in how we do things. We cannot be a sub-market anymore, right? So you can't have below market housing be this cute niche program in your community. We need to infiltrate the market more strategically in public-private partnership to get to scale. So I love to do strategy development, and I think a lot of you are on this call to find out what the heck we're talking about, or what are the ideas that are starting to get kicked around in the community. And so we're gonna start sharing some ideas. And I want to share this caveat that these are some things that we've heard and some things that have worked in other communities. This is not anything that is for certain for this community yet, but just I think it's important that people have specifics to react to, right? Some tangible stuff to think about. And I feel like the presentation has been very informative and pretty overwhelming, right? Like it's a tough nut to crack. So so strategy development, right? I still love Venn diagrams. I'm such a child of the 80s, but it really is this simple. One of the things that we do on our team is if we can't simplify housing programs, housing strategy, we've really failed a community. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that when you leave this call, you know what we're talking about. So we're looking for an overlap here with this project we're doing with the Economic Alliance, which we're going to talk more towards the end of the session on what that project is and how you can be engaged. But we're looking for the sweet spot between the community's vision, the resources at hand, the capacity we have, the capacity we may be creating, where we have political will, creativity, and partnership. And that's where you get strategy. I don't know if any of you have ever seen housing reports where, they say you need, I saw one in Colorado Springs a few years ago where they needed like, I don't know, it was like 30,000 units. It was so overwhelming. And then you get to the strategy part of this section and it's so vague. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'd be so mad if I was that group. So we are not doing that. We're going to be really specific. So next slide. So, we've got toolboxes and these evolve over time. And some of these tools are more relevant than others at any point in a market, local market, right? And sometimes we talk about these tools and they're not implemented correctly too. So the thing that we're solving for here is good strategy, but also that we're thinking about implementation, because if the implementation isn't strong, these strategies don't work, right? So there's always incentives, and we're always thinking about incentives. Again, if you can create incentives in the marketplace and you can get the market to do more low market or below market, you get more scale. So that's always a good thing. There's, a lot of these things have been around for a long time, reducing parking, fast track processing, allowing affordable housing in more zones. This is a big one. And I think the city of Durango is working on this right now, where if you have commercial zoning, you could do housing by right. That's just a really easy thing that communities are starting to do. In fact, I know the city's doing many of these things, density bonuses. If there's more incentives out there, share them with our team. I know there's a lot of really bright people on this call. Public-private partnerships, I know people get sick of hearing this, but this is really where there's major impact that can happen, right? So you can build on public land, you can provide public financing, property tax exemption is really important. Habitat for Humanity, different programs, incentivizing those. Andy's asking housing by right. That means, Andy, that if I go to buy a piece of land, that it is zoned for housing and I don't have to go through an onerous public process to be able to build housing on that location. And it's a term we use a lot in housing, so thanks for asking. Development regulations, there's different ways, but at the end of the day, development regulations, you're trying to find a balance between keeping your community looking good, right? And having nice development and not crazy development with having development, right? And having enough opportunity to build in the market that you don't have what we have today, right? And again, it's not because of regulation only that we have a shortage, it's a lot of other things. Funding, since I've been doing this for 15 years in Durango, funding was always the one I didn't like to talk about because we didn't have a lot of it, right? We had a few tools in our toolbox. Well, guess what, right? We have a lot more money to play with right now. And what we're hearing in other communities, and we may hear it from La Plata County, is money will not, money's not going to solve it. We still have to make sure there's somewhere to build it, right? So you got to have all these strategies going together. Anybody on my team want to add anything to the toolbox? Any comments? Nope.
I think
Yeah.
you covered it well, Jen. The only thing I would say is, we talked about sort of the different price points, and I think a key takeaway that's so important is it's all of these and it's more. Even if we're just focusing in on sort of the more traditional workforce, 80 to 100%. In looking at the biggest gap that Root had, it's still going to take a multitude of solutions in order to really make a dent.
I'll just make one comment, and it goes back to my previous slide. People ask me, well, which ones are we going to do? Right? We're going to do the ones where there's will and capacity and money, right? So our team's doing interviews right now across the community to figure out which one of these might be the best fit right now. So next slide, Matt. Again, want to keep community planning around housing as clear as possible. It's, again, not super complicated. Any good strategic plan is going to first make sure you preserve what you have whenever you can, right? We cannot be losing and going backwards. And so this is things like preserving mobile home parks, preserving existing housing like Tamarind Square, preserving naturally occurring affordable housing, which I don't know if we have a lot of that anymore, but it's, again, we have to be doing all of these things at the same time in this market. Promoting and developing new housing is a big thrust right now. And then we're going to talk a little bit about increasing housing, access to housing, and keeping people in housing who are already housed. Next slide. Just to be really specific. So, this community's already got a nice track record around preservation, right? So a lot of folks came together to preserve the Riverview Mobile Home Park. Congratulations to those residents. Homes Fund City, lots of great people were involved in that. $14 million deal, super great. A couple years ago, we did Tamarind Square, which is that property on 3rd Avenue that's for low-income seniors and people with disabilities. We were able to recapitalize that with private activity bonds and clean up the property, and it'll be affordable for another 20 years. Expect Mercy Housing and some properties that were built 20 years ago to start coming in to do the same thing. Next. And then again, promote and develop below market housing. These are ideas we're hearing locally and or are happening other places that are on our radar. So identifying a development pipeline and helping to subsidize land development, right? This takes capacity plus resources so that we can create below market opportunities. One of the things we're hearing is interest in multiple sites and multiple different options. And what we're going to do as part of this process is help countywide hone in where should the community come together on the top 3 opportunities. Where is their scale? Where does it make sense? Increasing development capacity has been a challenge for a long time. And I'm really excited because I think this community has some really good ideas on how to solve that capacity. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then subsidizing development with increased state and federal sources, as well as using public financing tools. Hearing a lot of conversation and interest in this. And then again, I just want to call out, we have Senator Bennett and Senator Hickenlooper's staff on this session, which is awesome. Thank you so much for the work that you all do. And I usually have a slide at the beginning of these sessions, but I didn't today. I mean, most people don't know that housing is like 10 to 1 funded by the federal government, right? So it's a huge resource, and it's a huge moment in time. And I know the federal government's looking at changing income limits as well. So lots of potential on the horizon there. Simplify, streamline the planning and entitlement process. We've been talking about this for 20 years. It really does make a difference. We can talk more about that, but I don't think anybody who does development would argue this point, right? And then creating a supportive development environment and creating consistency across the region. So one of the things when I first ran the Regional Housing Alliance many years ago is the city and county had different regulations, and they're going to have different regulations, but where you can align, right? And like the joint planning area and other places, you're going to create a friendlier development opportunity. Next slide. Oops, we skipped one, Matt, sorry. Stabilizing those who are already housed. I just want to keep coming back to that. There's a lot of resources to do this. And this is programs that are run by Housing Solutions, which has been in the community for many, many years. These are important programs we want to continue to support. So we learned during COVID that people were living on the edge. We knew this. There's thousands of households in La Plata County that are paying too much for rent, and people were evicted or lost their homes. So just overall housing strategy, we want to make sure that those programs continue, and there's lots of funds to do that. Just wanted to call that one out. Then I think I'm going to hand it back to Lisa.
Thank you very much, Jen. I want to highlight some of the affordable homeownership programs that Homes Fund provides, and just give you a little bit of a snapshot of what we do, who we are, and what challenges we're facing kind of go as we start 2022. So Homes Fund, we're a nonprofit organization. We're based in Durango. We're also what's called a CDFI. It's a community development financial institution. And we primarily provide homebuyer education, housing counseling, and mortgage assistance. The homebuyer education and housing counseling programs are to really make sure that people are ready for affordable and sustainable homeownership, giving them general information through the homebuyer education class and really specific information for their household during the one-on-one counseling. And then the mortgage assistance is where we provide financing that covers the gap between a first mortgage that people can afford and the higher home prices. So like I was saying, let's say a household can afford a $300,000 first mortgage, except the house that they found is $375,000. We would provide a second mortgage for that $75,000. Our most popular format for providing that $75,000 would be a shared appreciation loan. So it's at 0% interest, no monthly payments. They pay us back the principal plus a proportional share of the appreciation when they sell, or in 30 years, or when they refinance. And that's really helping out, like I was saying on a slide 15 slides ago, it's helping out on the household side to increase their buying power. Unfortunately, we are facing obstacles right now because there's just a lack of supply of homes, and a lot of the buyers who could potentially use our program are getting outbid by people who are coming in with cash. When you have complicated financing, like needing to get multiple mortgages, often sellers will take a cash offer over a more complicated financed offer. And so that is something that we're really struggling with. We're struggling with increasing interest rates, which are going to negatively affect affordability moving forward as well. But the program has been very successful, and we have helped almost 400 households to purchase a home with the mortgage assistance. Over almost 2,000 households have used our services overall and have gone on to purchase a home. Next slide, please. So we've had to do some pivoting and expand our services lately. So one thing that we're doing is our manufactured and mobile home loan program, where we're taking some of that naturally occurring affordable housing, that NOAA that's been mentioned a couple of times. Homes that are in manufactured home parks are often that NOAA naturally affordable naturally occurring affordable housing. But those are often very difficult to finance, and Homes Fund will step in and help to finance those homes in an affordable way. We're also working with some local governments, several of the cities and counties in our area, to administer deed restriction programs so that there can be a subsidy more on the front end, and then we could maintain that affordability as we go. We're going to need deeper and deeper subsidy and more restrictive covenants on these homes in order to retain affordability. It makes me a little sad, to be honest with you, but the times are changing, and this is what it's looking like we're going to be needing. And we're also able to do some kind of creative things, such as providing part of the financing for the Animas View Mobile Home Park, a much larger organization out of New Hampshire called Resident Owned Communities. Rock Capital USA was able to provide the real bulk of that financing, but we were really happy to provide some local support. And then we're also able to provide some funding, some loans to developers of affordable housing. So there are other organizations that are also resources, but I wanted to highlight some of the things that Homes Fund does. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Lisa. That was great. We're lucky to have such a unique organization doing this kind of work in our area. So the other piece, obviously, it's going to come into play around strategy development is you got to have the capacity to follow through, right? So again, whenever we do strategy work at the local level, you want to make sure you support your core infrastructure, right? Homes Fund, Habitat, Housing Solutions, Mercy, Volunteers America, right? Just make sure that our existing programs can thrive. And in this environment, this is maybe the first time in my career I get to say this, there's a much bigger pie, right? So we're not going after this small pie anymore. And so we just need to create that space where we can all do more good work. The Regional Housing Alliance, I loved running it for many years. It's a great entity. Community leaders, the city, county, Bayfield, Ignacio, many of you are on this, have decided to reconstitute this agency and have it coordinate workforce housing opportunities and identify long-term funding for housing. And my understanding is they'll be getting leadership either by hiring consultants or staff this year to make that happen. For folks that are not familiar with the Regional Housing Alliance, it's a multi-jurisdictional housing authority. That's a mouthful, but it's a special designated entity in the state of Colorado that allows it to raise its own funding and do lots of interesting things that you can't do with a traditional housing authority. So anyway, and it can take more risk than like the city or county could. So it's going to be, I think, pretty exciting. We're always thinking about how to assist local governments right now because, Mike French is paying us because the city of Durango put in a grant to DOLA, right? Like most of these funds are going to flow through city, county, Bayfield, Ignacio. And I don't know that they all have the ability to hire staff right now, right? So part of our strategy really needs to think about whether it's the RHA or some other way, how we really support those local governments. And then private developers are a huge partner in all of this work. Whenever we have an interested and willing private developer who wants to figure out how to do below market housing opportunities, we need to act quickly, have conversations, and see if we can pilot some opportunities. Continue to import development partners. So again, we always want to use our local capacity first. And the truth is we're not always going to have the capacity we need in this moment. So for example, converting the Best Western into affordable housing, we're almost done with due diligence. There was not a development group that could do that locally. So we brought in a group. We will continue to look at opportunities to bring in capacity if we need it. And then we've got the city has fair share agreements. Can these agreements help to get units or land? We know that they're looking at doing some updates to that program, but it's still a resource in the community. Next. A couple comments about private sector strategies, right? Again, so employers, we have some employers here. We've already have some exciting things happening with Fort Lewis. But employers can always work on building mortgage assistance. And again, this year is a tough year, but we hope that what we're hearing in the community, there is going to be some units and pipeline in the next 2 to 3 years. So maybe employers can be thinking about seeding those funds this year, so they're ready to go. I think it's an incredible resource because this is also how you're going to leverage some of the government funds that are coming down, right? So stacking resources. Scott Shine, you gave us lots of great information when we talked about the many, many units in the pipeline. Mike Seacrest, there's lots going on in the county. We need to take advantage of this pipeline, right? Why would we not try to look for ways to partner with the private sector and have set aside units, whether it's providing density bonuses or funding, fast tracking or infrastructure, a combination of things. I was talking to a woman I respect greatly named Wendy Sullivan, who's like kind of the queen of policy. She's up in Whitefish right now, and I'm going to get their policy because they have done a really good balanced approach between asking for set asides, but really having a long list of ways to offset costs. So interested in seeing what they're doing up there. And then we want to make sure that the private sector knows what's happening with funding, right? So I had a call this week where someone is interested in doing some innovative work, and I wasn't aware of some of these funding sources. So kind of doing this, connecting the dots. One more slide for me. Public sector, so powerful right now. Again, repurposing your underutilized assets. We know that several of the public entities on this call have land or buildings that they can repurpose. Please, 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 can we talk to you about that before you do anything else? We'd love to have a joint shared strategy around public land in the community and a clear vision on how we can develop these together. You know, an example too of identifying redevelopment commercial properties, you know, the Best Western on 160, creating public will for increased residential development. We don't talk about this enough, public will. So, you know, just keeping in mind that, again, we can have all the money in the world, but if we can't cite projects, we're going to have some challenges, and sort of getting ahead of that. I've heard from other leaders across the county, it'd be nice to have a coalition again of folks that can show up at meetings and say, we need housing. Identifying incentives like pre-development funding to activate sites. This is a big one. Pre-development is the risky, right? The beginning of a process where you're trying to figure out if something's going to work, and you have to pay for studies, and you have to, you know, you could spend $100,000 without blinking on pre-development. But if you have a site that's viable, it will leverage $5, $10, $20 million. So we have to get more creative on getting access to pre-development in the community. Again, funding and supporting the RHA, Homes Fund, and other nonprofit partners to scale efforts when possible and build local capacity for the long term. Right, we want to keep infrastructure local so that we can continue long term, and this is a sustainable. We're taking all of this funding, we're investing it in this moment in time, and it's going to pay off in the community longer term. And then identifying, creating a local public funding stream. Lots of great ideas already that we're hearing in the community, and this will be part of the conversation moving forward. I have talked too much. I'm going to hand it back to Jonathan.
Thanks, Jen. No, I think that was good. So next slide, please. You know, Jen kind of actually put that out in the chat. What other strategies should be considered? So what else do you think makes sense for La Plata County? And we'll just either raise your hand and chat out loud, or put them into the chat.
It looks like Mike Segrest and Tim Zink already responded in the chat with a couple of ideas. Mike talks about, you know, the challenge with lending institutions really having that 30% of income limit. But, you know, there's some opportunity there if that were potentially on a sliding scale for people at higher income levels who could afford to pay a little bit more for housing, under the assumption that A, their income's probably going to grow over time, and B, with the fixed mortgage cost, they'll be able to close that gap. So I think that is a really interesting strategy, and definitely would be interesting to talk to some of our local financing partners with, although I know a lot of that is regulated at the federal level. And then Tim Zink put in a suggestion that, you know, we all know about the challenges with developing condos with the construction defects regulation, and potentially a developer could build apartments and then sell them after a 10-year period and use the funding that they get from the sale of those properties to finance the next round of apartments.
So Mary and Jonathan, I'm not going to put you on the spot right now, but what this makes me think of is Shanahan's property in Denver, right? Is it the telecondos? Are you familiar with that property?
Oh, La Tela. Yes.
Latela, yeah.
Mhm.
So there could maybe be a conversation because I know he figured out at least how to do the condo piece.
Yeah, definitely.
And there's been a couple other condos recently. Habitat for Humanity, Metro Denver partnered with the Denver Housing Authority to put together some, I can't remember if they were townhomes. I think they did condos too, but for folks who don't know this construction defect litigation, not to go super into it, but essentially there was a problem, and so there's a real issue that condos were being built and they were being built shoddily, and so when a condo sort of fell apart and there was a big leak or something like that, then the folks were getting together and suing the developer for having these defects. So now there's this need to have really, really high insurance if you're a builder building condos to cover in case that happens. And so a lot of developers feel like the whole condo industry got damaged because of a few bad players. Essentially, they were making really, really bad buildings, but it's had this depressing effect or this suppressing effect on the construction of condos across the board. So that is something that has definitely affected things. Now, to be clear, however, the lack of condos being built is not only because of that. There's a lot of evidence out there that states that essentially it's just because rental housing has become much more of a popular development strategy for developers. So there's a lot more interest in doing that as well. But yes, I see what Mary says about being a great missing middle housing. So there was a suppressing effect on condo development, and the market changed a little bit because there was a higher demand for rental housing. So there's two reasons. The other thing to note is your idea is, I think, a good one. There is this, you'll find this pushback a little bit though, because long-term housing is, if you're using public subsidy to build affordable housing in an area where land is scarce, you're going to want that housing to last as long as possible to have sort of the biggest bang for your buck, because every year, if in 10 years, how much more expensive will the housing market be in 10 years if you lose that affordable housing, right? And how much more difficult will it be to subsidize and create it again? So there's a balance between, getting these sort of units up and ready as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, but then also making sure that we preserve them long-term so that you don't face the same issue every few years. And that speaks to some of the preservation issues that Jen spoke to. So yeah, part of the strategy, for sure, not to be too negative on that. I think there's something there. So other questions or ideas? I see another one just came in. Pursue attracting local modular home builder to reduce costs and provide local employment, fading west in Buena Vista. Interesting enough, we were talking about, or Jen was talking about the bigger pot of funding, right? So one of those that's at the state level or just in general right now. So there's a $400 million fund that's going to go through legislature this year that was funded through ARPA funding. Compare that to previous years, pre-COVID, there was probably 20 million, 30 million at the state level. So 400 million is a lot of money. One of the strategies that the governor actually put into this, actually has to go through and pass though, is an incentives grant to attract a modular home building company to come in and start building these units. So if that passes and there's that incentive there, I would recommend a strategy that tries to make sure that that developer or those developers end up on the western side of the state to potentially service this region. So good idea. And thank you, Mary. Yeah, the Federal American Rescue Plan Act was that ARPA acronym I said earlier. Other ideas? Incentives for homeowners to rent long-term instead of short-term. Yeah, Mary, looks like you want to take that, or Jen?
Jen might know of incentives. I haven't seen that done in the incentive strategy. I've only seen it done through having caps. So saying a certain percent of housing stock in a community can be used for short-term rental, and it's on an application process. And once that number is hit, then there are no more short-term rental licenses. But I don't know if anyone else has seen an incentive-based program.
I thought there was one in Crested Butte or somewhere in that sort of area, but I'll have to double check. But if anybody else knows, yep. go ahead.
I know Salida was looking at it, and you know there are pros and cons to everything. But one of the kind of unfortunate cons is that you're subsidizing the landlord directly. And so there's some controversy on that.
I want to take, oh, thanks, Lisa. I want to take on Kevin's question real quick. What are the sort of incentives for employers to get involved? Just quickly, obviously, mortgage assistance, doing their own mortgage assistance program, but we're actually working with a couple employers on land and building rental housing that we could do a preference marketing for their employees first. So land, so you'll see later on, we we have asks for employers. You'll hear more about that.
Yeah. Let's see. There's obviously an incentive for the employers to find an answer to that question because they're losing their workforce. But it's difficult for there to be a we were in our smaller breakout group, we were talking about the difference between a small business will have that problem, but it's not like they can provide housing in the same way that really, really large employers do. So it kind of differs on the scale. But there's ways. It's something we'll be exploring.
So should we keep moving forward with some of the stuff that we're working on?
Yeah.
Great. Mark, if you're trying to say something, feel free to put it in the chat as well.
Okay, so yeah, home stretch here, guys. Just a couple more slides. So where does this all put us now? And Mike spoke to this in the Mike French in the very beginning, but there's this 3-year strategy that we're working on with the EHA. And we already started, kicking this off with doing interviews with various stakeholders, employers, developers, all kinds of folks to sort of try and identify different strategies and also the opportunities, finding land, all those things we're working on, bringing a lot of experience to bear as well as a local footprint, especially with Jen there on the ground. So we're really, really excited to be working on this. It's just interesting. When I first started in this world in housing, it was below market rate housing or lower income housing. All that was treated almost like as a 4-letter word, and you couldn't even say it, and people would freak out. But now there's so much more interest because I think everyone is starting to see how it's affecting everyone around them at all different income levels. So on one side that's bad, but on the plus side, it's really heartening to see the whole community come around this. So really excited to figure out some solutions with you guys. In the focus of this initiative, of this 3-year plan, is on the slightly higher income side of it. So the workforce housing, however you want to define that slightly higher income, because you guys have done a lot of work in the past on the very, very low 30% AMI, and now there's this missing middle that we'll be focusing on. So next slide, please. Let's see. Yeah, I was just thinking about how hard it used to be. I was thinking of it was like
Jonathan,
4 hour.
I'm gonna just do a time check. Mike wants us to try to get through the scope so we can
Well, then I'll
open
not
it
tell
up.
the story. Then it's a good one, but I won't go into it. Our scope of work: develop this plan. We're going to make sure it reflects the factors that will apply to unique factors that will apply to county. Leverages all the capacities and all the resources and everything that we have here to carry that as far as we can. Get some strategies in place, and the end goal is not just having strategies, but finding a way to have better community coordination around this. So it's this group effort, harness all this energy to pull us in the right direction together, and then identify funding and get going. So that is the plan, and I believe that's the end of the slides. Great, and it looks like we are at time. I don't know, Jen or Mike, if you want to say something else.
No, I think what's might be important, Jonathan, is how do we keep in touch with this group? Most of this group is very active with us, but there might be some folks that want to be updated on a consistent or some kind of cadence. So I think it's important that we offer that opportunity to them.
So we are working on our sort of community engagement strategy for the next 3 months. Mike French, we are definitely going to take advantage of your membership meetings for updates. So if you're a member of the Economic Alliance, you'll hear from us during the meetings. We'll probably also have a standalone meeting again where we come back to and open up to the community and talk about some of the strategies and get feedback. So we will definitely have another one of these meetings. In the interim, if you have ideas, thoughts, suggestions, please email us. Any one of us, and we can connect to the team, and we'd be happy to chat with you one-on-one or hear what you have to say about input, etc. Anybody else want to mention or add on from the team? There's a lot of really smart, powerful people here. I hope that you all engage as we move forward. We need your help.
Thank you all for attending. We will have a copy of the presentation, the slides, as well as the video available on the Alliance website. And that website is yeslpc.com. So it's YES Larry Paul Charlie.com.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Elizabeth, are you still with us? And Matt, we can probably, are we done recording? Okay.